Hi class, this is your lecture video on the sea change in American politics that took place during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the period you've been reading about in your book. That sea change involved a large political shift away from the Democratic Party as the dominant national party and toward the Republican Party. On what basis do I say that the Democratic Party was the reigning national party in this earlier period? Let's take a look at the period 1932 to 1964, and what you'll find is a whole string of Democratic Party victories at the presidential level. The Democrat FDR, for example, comes into office in 1932, serves 4 terms until 1945 when he dies in office. FDR helped to build a New Deal coalition of Democrats that really pulled in voters from across the country in the depths of this terrible economic crisis, in the depths of total war with World War II, and he gets a bunch of different people voting Democrat, kind of a big umbrella party. Northern blacks and southern whites, urban and rural people, native-born and immigrant people. So there are all kinds of people voting Democrat. It's a majority party, winning in all of those different elections in 1930, bringing Roosevelt to office, helping him to usher in those New Deal reforms such as Social Security, the federal labor legislation. A more activist government is what many people wanted at that time, and that's what the New Deal Democrats sort of brought with them. And so Truman's elected in 1948. Then you have Eisenhower in the 1950s, which you could say, okay, Dr. Case, that kind of breaks the argument down. It breaks the chain of these Democratic victories. It does, because Eisenhower's a Republican. But I would say, and many historians note as well, that he's a moderate Republican. He does not really dismantle those New Deal reforms. And so you have Kennedy coming into office in 1960, a Democrat, Johnson in 1964. And Johnson expands the New Deal hugely brings in those Great Society programs that are meant to try to attack, really abolish poverty in the United States, very ambitious programs, and education reform, as well as Medicare, Medicaid, environmental legislation, so an activist government, certainly. Now, when we look back to the 1964 election, we see the quote-unquote father of modern-day conservatism, Barry Goldwater, running for president in 1964 as a Republican candidate. And the fortunes of the Republican Party in 1964 don't really seem that promising, because Goldwater loses by a landslide to Johnson. It's the largest landslide in American presidential history. And so the reason is because many Americans at the time kind of saw him as an extremist. They were afraid he would push the nuclear button, or he would dismantle the New Deal, or block civil rights legislation, which Americans were increasingly favoring. But by 1980, only 16 years after Goldwater's terrible defeat, the Republican Party is articulating a lot of the same ideas that Goldwater was around small government specifically. And you have the Republican Party emerging as a dominant force in American politics by 1980. President Reagan, elected in 1980 and 1984, wins by large margins. George H.W. Bush in 1988. Then you have Clinton. And Clinton is a Democrat, so he seems to again break the chain. And he also seems like a liberal Democrat to many people. But really, when you compare him to his Democratic Party predecessor, say in 1972, George McGovern's a liberal Democrat. Reagan, comparatively speaking, is a moderate. And so he's kind of responding to the fact that the political spectrum has shifted to the right, and he's trying to find a middle path between Reagan-era conservatism and the New Deal, Great Society kind of Democrats. And so he's kind of trying to forge this other way. And so he's more of a moderate, kind of like Eisenhower was a moderate. Then you have George W. Bush, elected in 2000, 2004, Republican president. So the Republican Party has this whole string of successes that were a consequence of the rising conservative movement. That's an intellectual movement, like the neoconservatives, but then you also get this grassroots movement. And so, a lot of your chapters is trying to explain, why do you get this political shift? One way of thinking about it is that conservatism offered Americans, or a number of Americans anyway, a number of people don't agree, but they do offer Americans a kind of compass in a period of great uncertainty and tremendous upheaval. Many white Southerners, for example, are really rejecting the Democrats' the alignment of the Democratic Party with civil rights reform. And if you look at the elections in 1948, you look back at that, the election in 1968, you see Deep South white Southerners particularly bolting away from the Democratic Party as it embraces civil rights, moving toward first independent parties like the Dixiecrats and then George Wallace, and then moving into the Republican Party in 1980. But there's other streams coming into the Republican Party. There were people who were highly distrustful of government in general in the wake of Watergate, in the wake of the U.S. defeat in Vietnam. They're coming out of a Sun Belt experience with suburbia, small government, low regulation, low union strength, that sort of thing, and they're coming out of that experience. Despite that the Sun Belt did have a lot of federally funded infrastructure and the defense industries and that sort of thing, they do come out of that kind of larger experience with a real commitment to small government and a number of Americans kind of looking at the landscape and thinking the United States is kind of unraveling. You get urban riots in Newark, Watts, Detroit, over 100 other cities during the 1960s. You get the rise of racially separatist groups that are rejecting integration and rejecting nonviolence. You get clashes between protesters of all kinds, including anti-war protesters and the police. So it seems like kind of a scene of great disorder to a number of people. And those folks who are moving in a more conservative direction stress law and order and national unity. And they're as well responding to women's rights, to gay rights, to those challenges to traditional notions of family and marriage, sex and sexuality, the nature of women and men and their roles in society, those kinds of things. At the same time, all those things are happening. You have an economic crisis of really grave proportions in the 1970s, stagflation, rising trade deficits, oil dependence, and then as well oil embargo, gas lines, right? And so many people are kind of looking at this scene, and they're looking to the Republican Party to secure, in no uncertain terms, a kind of return of the United States to global leadership, preeminence, stability, these kinds of things. So as you read about Ronald Reagan, you have chapter 9 and 10 that kind of talks about Ronald Reagan quite a bit. We're focusing on him because he is this person who really leads the conservative movement in the Republican Party to this new era of power and influence in American politics. But like any president, really, there's a tension between the ideas and the rhetoric, the image and the rhetoric of Reagan, and the realities of his administration. So just try to get a sense of the differences between those things. Where they kind of come together, where the tension builds between them, because sometimes his policies don't quite reflect what he's saying, and that's just the way it is. It's contradictory in some respects. So we'll leave it at that, and we hope you're having a good close to your semester.